Chaloha, and welcome to Haydn Behind the Music Stand. I'm your host, Patty Ryan, and with me is Francesca McNeeley, who is a freelance cellist and private teacher in the Boston area. She is also a frequent guest with Castle of Our Skins, which is a nonprofit organization that promotes classical music of Black composers. And we'll be talking about trends in music education. Welcome, Francesca. Thanks for being here.
I'm so happy to be here, Patty. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So we actually have kind of a funny origin story in a certain way. For me, it's actually slightly embarrassing because we got to know each other at Tanglewood Music Center, which is a summer festival at the Tanglewood grounds in Lenox, Massachusetts. You might have heard me speak about Tanglewood in the past, but it's just such a wonderful place. I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversations about that. So we met there. It was my second year and your first year there as fellows of the Tanglewood Center Music Orchestra. And we were kind of friendly, but didn't really get to know each other. And then the final concert right before everyone was about to leave and go home gets really emotional because everyone has these shared memories over the past 2 months together. And Francesca and I were stand partners. And just to try to condense this story, I just started bawling my eyes out at the end of Mahler's First Symphony, this glorious D major section with the brass. And I was just that person on stage, just being a blubbering idiot, you know?
Yeah.
So I can't imagine what was running through your head when you're like looking over at your stand partner just being the ugliest crier ever.
No, I'm not one to judge ugly crying. It's been a very long year.
That's fair. I know our endurance is really being tested this year.
Seriously. What was particular about our friendship was that I think we bonded in a lot of really dark places. I always think about our year as roommates in Houston. So I was out of school, going through my own kind of transition of like, what am I doing with my life? You were coming back to school after having gone on to other things, really like other kinds of programs, and were having your own existential crisis about being in a master's program. And so we were housemates, bedrooms on opposite sides of the house. So we'd always find like a communal meeting point in the kitchen, and we just like, shuffle over in our slippers over cranky because we hadn't had our caffeine yet and that kind of thing. But I remember that I guess we were in the house a lot at the same time just because of the way our schedules worked. And in that, we would always just like, there was just always something going on with somebody. And, I think it always balanced out. But I mean, every time I think of like our early friendship, it was just generally cynically like dark. Like it was just like a dark comedy. And we were there to support each other, but also like, what is life? Like, it was just like, everything was always so hard. There was always like a moment that we needed each other to like lean on. I don't know if I have that with everybody. That much sort of like dark and twistiness to like entangle us together. Yes. You could add it to a short list of like soul sisters in that regard.
Maybe soul sisters of being the dark and twisties. Oh no.
Absolutely. Congratulations.
Okay. Spitfire questions. Are you ready?
Oh boy. Holding on to my seat.
Mozart or Beethoven?
Beethoven.
Shostakovich or Prokofiev?
Prokofiev, please. Come on.
Netflix or video games?
Netflix, for sure. I mean, considering I don't have a TV, video games is a little more difficult, but...
Sure. Basil or cilantro?
I will lean cilantro. Not to hate on basil, but recently, Mary and I, my roommate, we found a fantastic shirt. There's a chef in Boston who had this really awesome shirt on his Instagram that I know Mary now owns that I really want to buy, but it's a Celtics logo, except that it says cilantro, and it's beautiful.
Oh, that's awesome.
Gotta give it up for Team Cilantro.
Anyway, Harry Potter, Star Wars, or Lord of the Rings?
This is harder because both Star Wars and Lord of the Rings had more to do with my early childhood, courtesy of my father. Embarrassing story about myself. I thought the characters from Lord of the Rings were real people for a very long time.
No.
And that would be courtesy of my dad, because he loved to tell these really fantastic stories about his friends Frodo and Gandalf. And I didn't know, I was none the wiser at that young age. And I'm not even going to tell you how old I was when I figured out it was all lies. But I was too old. So while I am partial to the Lord of the Rings trilogy for that reason, Star Wars we watched a ton because that was my dad's, his generation of cool films. But it was definitely Harry Potter that I'm still holding on to a little bit. I'm still waiting for my owl to swing by. For some reason, it seems to have gotten a little delayed, but I'm sure Hedwig's on her way. So not quite over that one yet. Still pretty sure I'm a wizard and no one's confirmed it for me. But it's okay. I'll get over it when I need to.
The adult program at Hogwarts.
School of Continuing Education.
Oh, goodness. Okay, moving on. Symphony or chamber music?
Chamber music, always, not to hate on, orchestra. I mean, we've obviously had amazing experiences playing in orchestra, but I think where my soul resides, and I think where a lot of my teaching desires go, is definitely in chamber music.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. Coffee or tea?
Oof. I mean, okay, I'll take this opportunity in the hopes of sponsorship. I'm gonna give a shout out to Number 6 Depot Blue Velvet Coffee, because that stuff got me through most of the last 6 years. It's amazing coffee, chocolatey, delicious, discovered at Tanglewood. Highly recommend. They're in West Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But that being said, I stopped drinking coffee about a year ago. So while I do miss it, I must say I'm now a tea person. I enjoy my little matcha lattes when I have the time to make them.
Favorite practice room?
Ooh, I mean, well, I'm not going to lie. There was once where I did practice in Symphony Hall on the stage. I did ask for permission. It was like a lunch break and nobody was around. So I definitely snuck in a little bit of practice and just did some Bach until I realized that people could hear me, and then I stopped.
Yes, that is the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that they leave the microphones on in the hall even if no one's playing or there. So Oftentimes when I'm sitting in the Minnesota Orchestra Library and someone's just on stage playing, I can hear everything.
Yes, and one of the cellists did swing by to see who it was, and I was mortified. So I remember that being like really nice until that door cracked open, and then the dream shattered. I was like, nope, don't do that again. But otherwise, I remember at Tanglewood, I was really partial to a particular practice cabin. I became very obsessed with it, and a little territorial, you might say, because I remember there was one morning where I got there like 5 minutes later than usual, and somebody was in my cabin.
How dare they?
I was not happy about it. Someone else's car was parked in front, and I had to go to a different one. And I remember practicing those scales with a lot of spite.
Okay.
I mean, I survived. I made it. But there is something nice about finding like a space that seems to not be in high demand by others, but it gives you like a lot of clarity and focus and, good lighting and all that stuff. It wasn't a named cabin. It was not like a Pizza the Hut, Jabba the Hutt thing. So I should have named it.
Well, it should have been your name on it. Everyone then would know that's Francesca's cabin always.
I should probably go for a quick drive over to Lenox and bring some paint.
Favorite professor shout out?
Two of the most influential professors, because I still think about those classes really vividly, to this day. One would be my AP Gov teacher, Mr. Baxter, who was also, had been a history teacher in a prior year, but he was just incredible. He was just wonderful. He had been like a Georgetown trained lawyer who retired and then decided to teach public school and was like, no, these kids need a good education. And he was awesome. I mean, he was brilliant. Classes were just really inspiring. And that was part of what inspired me to be a politics major as an undergrad. So he was really awesome. Mr. Baxter. Thank you. The other teacher would be from my undergraduate years, Kofi Agawu, who I believe now is one of Claire's professors at the CUNY Center in New York, because he's left Princeton and is now up there. But he was incredible. He taught a class called Music of Africa. The class wasn't really about music theory and that sort of approach, but it was very much about understanding the role that music can play in a lot of African societies and the different types of roles, whether it's social roles, but then also understanding the ways that colonialism impacted the sound of the music and understanding the different regions, the different tendencies for instruments. And I just thought it was really awesome. And one thing that was funny about that class was that Kofi himself is from Ghana, but his specialty isn't especially in African music. His specialty is as a Wagner and Mahler scholar. I could remember this incorrectly, but what I remember at the time was that Princeton wanted to offer this class, and basically he just said, no one else is allowed to teach this. As the only African on staff, no.
Well,
which is a great point to make, but I just thought that was interesting when he mentioned that, because I hadn't known that he was a Mahler scholar. So this happened in like an office hour where he was just kind of talking about it and then was showing me some of his other papers, because I think it had come up in a conversation. I just remember that was so cool. It was cool that he felt that kind of responsibility to make sure that the conversations around the music of Africa happened in the right way and framed it well for us. It's great when you have those professors where like you still think about moments in their classrooms, you think about the conversations, and it makes you think about what a good teacher is.
Absolutely. And also we should have that class at every single college, and that should be a required class, really. Most inspired musical hero of any genre?
Oof, that's a great question. I mean, I think it'll always come back to me, to Chris Celie of the Punch Brothers. If people aren't familiar with him, I highly recommend the Punch Brothers. It's the only bluegrass I really listen to, I guess. I'm not like a diehard bluegrass person, but I find the Punch Brothers to be so fascinating. I mean, they really pull influences from so many places. I know in their latest album, they had like a Debussy covers and a bit of Scriabin, when I was like, what? Cool. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. But when I listen to interviews with Chris Celie, I'm always impressed at how well-versed he is in all types of music. I think there was an interview where he was talking about the influences of Reich and Ives on his approach to mandolin. And I was like, what? Who are you? That's amazing. And if you haven't checked it out, there is an incredible recording of him playing some of the Barber Violin Concerto for a St. Louis Orchestra Pops show.
I just watched it. It is
incredible.
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. So I find it like endless inspiration in like watching how he is as an artist and watching the kinds of projects that he tackles. He's just awesome.
He definitely bends the genres. And that's
Yes.
something that I guess he and Yo-Yo and Edgar Meyer and Stuart Duncan also just did another album of Goat Rodeo, which they're a part of. And I mean, putting all those people together, I mean, they just are merging the divide between bluegrass to, oh, hi, Sushi. Gosh, wow.
Cameo appearance.
Yeah, seriously. She came out of nowhere and now there's a Sush butt.
Oh, what have you?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm back on track. What was I saying? Basically, Celie is awesome. Okay, most transformative performance experience.
It's less about the actual performance that happened on stage, but everything that happened leading up to that performance. My second From year, so From it's a program at Tanglewood for alums of the orchestra program. It's sort of like an ensemble in residence for the summer of alumni who pretty much exclusively work on living music, with some exceptions. There's some projects by other composers that come in, but for the most part, like 80% of what you do is commissions and working with the composition fellows and those kinds of projects. So my second From year, one of our projects was the Ben Johnston 4-string quartet called Amazing Grace. And this is still to this day the hardest thing I've ever had to put together. Truly, just like, I just can't even. It was so much blood, sweat, and tears. Okay. Quite literally. I mean, there was a lot of tears.
Blood?
Blisters, just from working too hard. Yeah. Nobody hurt each other. We did not attack each other. No, but it was so hard. I mean, the piece is 12 minutes long, and I don't even know how many dozens of hours we spent over 6 weeks trying to put it together. And every day we tackled it. We barely took time off of it, and it was just so hard. And even a few days before the concert, it was very easy for things to fall apart, but we did find ways to get through it. I remember when we were done with the project, finding all the scraps of calculations that were like on random pieces of paper thrown about the house because we were doing so much math to figure out the exact, like, to the decimal metric modulations, and we got really nuts with it. Like,
that's intense.
No, yeah, Mary and I were doing like scholarly research on JSTOR, trying to find articles and interviews with the composer to try to just like find out more and more and more. And it wound up being really helpful for sure. It was the most in-depth I think I've ever gotten with a piece of music. Just not accepting anything but the full answer, Huh. And all that for a 12-minute piece is so short. And what's incredibly frustrating is that it just sounds pretty. Like, you wouldn't know how hard it was. It's like, it's actually quite beautiful. So for the audience, it's like...
But why should it not sound beautiful? You're implying that doing a lot of work is going to make something sound bad.
Well, I guess you could say that, like, I guess it's more than just beautiful. It sounds easy. Like, it sounds like an effortless beauty.
Right.
Well, but it requires a lot of effort.
One would argue Mozart has the same troubles, but just less mathematics.
Right. Certainly less math, more unified sense of meter, perhaps. Well, and not to mention, so with the Johnston, not even just the meters, you have to switch intonation systems while playing the piece.
Oh, wow.
So that was a whole other mental reckoning of how to switch in and out of just and Pythagorean intonation as you're going through it, dealing with septimal commas, and like, it was...
Yeah.
It's just, and then that was also our first time dealing with any of those kinds of variables. And we had no choice in this context. Like, we had to deal with it. So not only were we trying to train our brains and our hands to do crazy, like metric modulations, but also cross rhythms across the ensemble in different pairs. Like, I know there was a section of the piece where like Mary and my part fit together as if it was a 9/8, but then Mary and Sam's part fit together as if it was a 6/8. But then Shafan and I fit together as if it was a 2/4. Like, it was just that kind of thing of like, we only made sense in pairs and cross pairs, but together it had to sound easy. But of course, what happens in chamber music, you hear a little bit of something else out of your right ear, and suddenly your mind wants to do something else. And so it was an interesting project. So there was that side of it, and then there was within your own playing, dealing with the intonation. Like, when I suddenly had to play an F that was a septimal comma F, I'm like, oh God, so it's that way,
Yeah.
And so at the end, I think my score looked insane. Like, it was color coded for pitches. There was like red lines, blue lines, green lines, depending on what I was trying to match. It was a mix of score and part, and it was just so hard. So I guess that was less about the actual performance. I mean, the performance felt great. It was fun. We got to just release and relax, but everything leading up to it was so difficult and worthwhile, I should say. And the piece was really, like, we felt really good about the performance, and we bonded a lot and forever as people.
Yeah. I just want to also do a quick couple term definitions, just so everyone knows what we tune to and what you will hear in pop music, rock music, whatever, is equal temperament or some version of that. There's a lot of other different ways of constructing pitch and organizing pitches. Equal temperament is just splitting the octave into 12 segments.
Would you have to imagine that like the sound itself is really being measured like it was on a ruler? And so what we're talking about is having equal spaced slashes, really. I mean, that's what equal temperament is taking that block called the octave and splicing things down evenly. But there are other intonation systems in which that's not the case, where, that first step is supposed to be a little bit bigger, second step a little smaller. So if you're looking at the ruler, the slashes, they would just be differently spaced.
Right. Of course, this could be an entire new episode of just talking about intonation, and it's probably really either boring or interesting, depending on who you are. But that was something that you're saying. So you're doing something that was not standardized and what we train for in conservatory. And also you're talking about metric modulation, which is where you slowly go from 1 meter and influencing the beat structure in a way to transform it into a new meter.
I mean, a simple example would be that if you have a piece that's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, right? And then if you decide to split that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and Celie, now you have this click and you would go 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. And so suddenly you took that small click, you group 3 of them together instead of the 2s that you'd been doing. And now we have a new sense of speed like that.
Right. And so this method was used before, but just wasn't really formalized or maybe wasn't as actively used. And now it's something that is more standard for us musicians to know about. Just in case you were wondering what Francesca was mentioning.
Oh, and Sushi Cat's back.
Sushi Crossing. Okay. Good. Okay. Next piece you'd like to learn?
Last weekend was the first of a 2-part panel on the George Walker Sonata that I was able to coordinate with a number of my mentors and friends. So it's great that you're catching me in between the two because I'm getting really excited to learn this piece.
Yeah, great.
So for people who don't know, George Walker was one of the preeminent American composers of the 20th century. He was the first African-American to win a Pulitzer in music, went to Curtis, first black soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra as a pianist. Really accomplished man. And it's such a shame that not everybody has played his cello sonata. It's really wonderful. It's of that same 20th century American era, and it could rival the Barber Sonata, except that most cellists in school have to go through and play the Barber Sonata, while most haven't heard of George Walker's. So we had arranged this panel to help highlight it in the repertoire and to also offer great tips and advice on it from 4 cellists who are very intimate with the piece, who each had a chance to play with the composer at different times in their life. And so it's interesting because they've all actually worked with the same pianist, except for one of them on this piece.
Funny.
So I look forward to kind of hearing what she has to say too, since she was somebody who's played it for him through phases of her life and his life. So that's been great to unpack that and to hear about it. And I really do want to play that next. I'd love to play it.
I mean, I want to play it too. I haven't played it
it's a
yet.
great piece.
Also, I haven't played Barber yet too. So I feel like, okay, I'm on equal footing now.
Play both. Go ahead.
Well, I'll play Walker first and then Barber. But
Fantastic. Good plan.
Okay, you did it.
Woo! Still here.
Congratulations.
Sweating.
All right, Francesca, walk me through your life story of celloing.
I was about 3 or 3.5 years old when I started playing the cello. It's a very long time ago. I think I'd actually started on violin first. I have an older sister and she plays the violin. And so, of course, when I got to be about the age she was when she started, I got the hand-me-down. I got the little violin to start on. And I mean, this is my own interpretation, but I probably just didn't want to do what she did. So cello was then my instrument. But we were living in Haiti at the time. So my early development was there. I remember playing a lot with the Saint-Unité Orchestra, which was a music school that my parents, particularly my mom, was heavily involved in when we lived there in Haiti. And so when I was little, I remember getting to play in the orchestra with the big kids. They would just sort of shove me somewhere in the middle of the section so that I wasn't too far in the back because I couldn't see because I was sitting on a tiny chair. I was a tiny person. So they put me in the middle. I know my mom loves to tell the story of my very first cello performance, which was in Haiti. And she was at the piano. My little yellow chair was put out. And I think I walked out with my frilly socks and green dress and played a bunch of open strings or something. I don't know what I was doing, but I don't think I'd been playing very long. And it can't have been more than like 4 or 5. But apparently, my mom loves to tell the story that I went out, I played, took my bow, big concert hall, because it was like the hall the orchestra played in. But then apparently when I went into the backstage, I burst into tears because I felt that I hadn't done enough. And I was just upset and I was crying and crying and crying. So then they had to let me back on stage where I proceeded to play open strings for a while, apparently. You could say I was born for the stage, Patty. But let's see. So living in Haiti, we moved to the U.S. We moved back and forth a couple times. I think the last time was when I was about 7, but my parents' decision for that to happen was really due to the political situation in Haiti. I know like one of the last vivid memories I have of being there, it was a day where we were coming back from the mountains, and I think it was a late night. We were driving, my dad was driving back. We were asleep in the back of the car, and I just remember being woken up to my dad lifting me out, and I was like drooped on his shoulder, and all I caught was a glimpse of like a flame at a distance, and it was really dark. My parents just like abandoned the car, and we had to walk. Well, we were being carried, but we had to go by foot back home. And I think later my dad told me that it was just like protests. Like things were just getting really violent, really dangerous, and they were just really worried about everyone's safety. So they wound up moving back permanently to the US. I know that they had hoped that there'd be a time that we'd move back to Haiti, but of course the more political situation never really got that much better. And obviously we all got entrenched in the schooling and stuff here. And so, you know, we stayed. So let's see, my mom had us going to a French school though the entire time. Until I was about 12, I was in a French school. Like the only class that was in English was gym. Everything else was French.
Right.
So I learned about French history, French grammar, French literature, French math even. And I know that when I had to
French
switch...
math? Wait, what is that? What's the difference?
They do it differently. It's the ages at which things were introduced. So we were doing geometry while I think in the US kids were doing algebra.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I don't think
it's not like
geometry
they have
really...
a system of mathematics that is different than anyone else's. Okay.
No, probably the biggest difference is just the commas, like, you know, a decimal, like the punctuation of things.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So even math was in French. So I know that gave me sort of a different kind of experience. Probably up until I was 12 or 13, I was always in really diverse environments. Because, I mean, in the Caribbean's inherently pretty diverse. I know people don't always know that if you haven't traveled. And I think, especially with Haiti, I think people don't realize that there is a bit of a color spectrum in Haiti. It's kind of a complicated history, complicated lineage. And with Haiti sharing an island with the Dominican Republic, there's a lot of complications, I think, what race really looks like, I guess, in the Caribbean. Even from a young age, like I was, you know, making music with people that both looked like me and didn't look like me. And it wasn't something I ever thought about. And then I think similarly when I got to the lycée, which was like the French school I was in, obviously, you know, Manhattan, New York, it's its own little ecosystem. But because that school was a French school, it tended to draw a lot of diplomats' kids. So I remember having classmates from Senegal, classmates from Togo. Some classmates were French, some were Spanish, some were Argentinian, some were, you know, just people came from a lot of different places, I guess. And so people approached French from a lot of different places and a lot of different purposes. But I hadn't really realized how unique that was. Obviously, there is diversity in America, duh. But I guess in the case of the French school, it's like we were all there for a shared purpose, but we were all intentionally coming from different places. I didn't realize how special that was. And I'll say that I don't even think I ever thought about my own racial identity until I was in American public school. I don't think I'd ever been asked, but I never had to think about those things, like those kinds of questions. And granted, that's my own privilege to have gone that late in life without having to ask those kinds of questions. I was very aware of the fact that there was a mixed Haitian American culture happening in our house. But in terms of having to explain it to people, having to just be faced with the questioning, that never happened to me until way later in life. Yeah. It never really mattered until people were asking questions, I guess. Like, what are you? So it's just interesting. Like I get to fall in the cracks, I guess, is what I'm saying. And maybe in that regard too, people will make of me what they want to. It's a weird, ambiguous place to get to float around in, I guess. So by like middle school, I was getting an American schooling, had switched. I did Juilliard pre-college at some point. But when time came for me to apply to college, I was not doing what everybody else was doing. So many of my pre-college classmates were just gung-ho about like, gotta do conservatory. But I'll admit that I did not leave high school with a very strong sense of myself, particularly as a cellist. I knew I loved music. I knew I loved my pre-college community and my friends and the experience, but I did not graduate with any kind of confidence that it was, you know, meant for me, so to speak.
Can I back up just a hair just to say Juilliard Prep is a program through the Juilliard School for 5th grade to high school or something level.
Yeah, the majority of people, I would say.
To start music education at a high level, I would assume.
Yeah, and it's an intense one. I mean, I think by my senior year of high school, my schedule on Saturdays was 8:30 a.m. to about 8 p.m. Wow. With just a couple breaks. So yeah. I had extra classes, but everybody had to do music theory, ear training, one chamber group. Some people had 2. Orchestra would be on Saturdays, private lesson studio class.
Wow.
You could pack that day, and it was all on Saturday. It was definitely a real commitment. I mean, I wouldn't have been there if I didn't like being there, but still at the same time, it obviously can be a really competitive environment. Yeah. And I just remember that, you know, there were just a couple people, I think in my studio, but also just generally in the school that got put up on little pedestals. And I was very aware that I wasn't one of those people, but I internalized that as like, oh boy, I'm just not good enough.
Sure.
So I was among the rare percentage of people that didn't bother applying for anything music related. But when I applied for college, I did keep in mind that I wanted to wind up at a school where music was like an important part of the community there. So schools like University of Michigan, let's see where else. Well, Princeton's where I wound up, which has a great music department. But that was more my focus, was just winding up at a school that made me happy, but that would give me the room to keep playing cello to the seriousness that I wanted.
So what was it like transitioning from politics to music?
Yeah, I mean, socially, I definitely had a bit of overlap where there were some friends that I, kept from my pre-college days for sure. Probably the hardest thing, honestly, was that there were just a number of people I met who, they almost tried to make me feel bad for having had an academic background. I'll never forget, I think it was one of the first times I auditioned for a major festival. This is when I was still at Princeton, but I remember walking into that audition, and before I even played a note, like I had just sat down, the proctor looks at my resume, and he just goes, "Princeton, what are you doing here?" Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's not a great feeling to start this audition on, but okay.
Right.
But the response was like, academics, like, why are you wasting your time here at this festival?
Yeah.
And that certainly wasn't the only time I encountered that. In fact, I remember like at Rice that became like socially, that was a bit of an annoying sticking point where people would be like, "Oh, you went to Princeton, you're too smart for us," or "You're too this," and like almost pushing me out of a lot of social situations. And
weird. Well, I also think that when someone says they went to an Ivy League school, you're put on an instant pedestal. And
right.
Elitism is maybe the word that gets tossed around there, which then makes it look like to those who weren't in those schools that it's this, we're the dumb ones and everyone or something. I don't know.
Right. And the irony of that was that I was the one with the imposter syndrome, right?
That's what I'm trying to point out. Yeah.
I was the one showing up, having not had 4 years of intensive undergrad and being really nervous about it. Mm-hmm. It was like years of me secretly being worried that I was behind. Like, oh God, like I have to make up for having not had 4 focused years in the way that other people did. And then winding up at a competitive master's program like Rice. It was just hard. That's what school's for. And it's just not fun when you meet people who think that you should be using, they're like, "Oh, but you have a mind. Like, why would you play an instrument?" It's like,
because it takes a mind to be a musician as well.
Yeah, there's just this attitude that those are somehow mutually exclusive. Like, I'm sorry, we want dumb people here only with the instruments. What? Right. Like, I don't know. It's just really, it's a weird attitude to meet. That certainly left me with a chip on my shoulder that it took me a long time to sort of toss out. And I think my way of sort of clinging to that, for the longest time, especially the first couple years at Rice, I knew I had the safety net of a politics degree from Princeton. Like, I always knew, like, oh God, if it turns out I really can't play scales and tune, okay.
I see.
I'm going to use my degree and like just escape hatch,
Got it.
I think it wasn't until maybe living in Boston that I finally forced myself to drop that narrative in my head. It's like, no, it's just embrace that you're doing this. Like, stop clinging to that escape button or whatever in case it turns out you can't do this, And I'm sure at a place like Rice, I was probably just trying to seem really cool, but I was just imposter syndrome. And of course, actually, it's funny because my Princeton experience was like that too, especially my first 2 years at Princeton. It was just severe imposter syndrome. I was sitting there going, oh my God, like, why am I here? Did I only get in because I play the cello? Did I only get in because I'm biracial? Like, why am I doing here? Is it because I speak French? Like, I was just looking for any excuse beyond maybe you deserve it.
Right.
Like that was the one story that I was like, that can't be it.
That can't be right.
You would think that, the privilege of being at a great institution would make that a moot point. But no, I felt I was just a fraud and somebody was going to catch me at some point, And so I'm feeling really defensive and not like aggressively on the outside, but just towards myself, more scared than powerful.
I think in starting this podcast and interviewing a lot of my friends, and we've gotten to a place in our lives that we feel way more confident and way more self-assured about where we are and what our purpose is in music, where our place is in music. I even remember this talk with Michal Jojatu with our cello section at Tanglewood. He's a Boston Symphony cellist. I remember him always saying, there is a place for every one of you, every musician in the world. Don't ever think that you don't have a function. And what I'm realizing interviewing a bunch of my friends and seeing where they've gone and what they're doing and the amazing things that they're doing is inherently, they all felt like they were imposters in some fashion or another. There's not really one person that was just like, oh yeah, I was born like this. I think what's challenging about being in a conservatory environment or going into music is it's this place where everyone is really trying to figure out what they really like doing or what they're being awarded for and how that is measured in their self-worth and value. And when there's people that come in with different backgrounds, like someone who comes from an academic place like Princeton or whatever, it's easy to look at that and scratch your head because that's not what the convention is.
Right. No, I'll say in some ways I feel like the story of my life is that. It's like not fitting into anybody's boxes.
And also just the idea, I think, as being a musician, that means that you shouldn't have an academic understanding or background in anything else. I think is so flawed. I think that's a stigma that I wish would be eradicated from the identity of what it is to be a musician. Even people like Midori and people like Yo-Yo Ma, they went and actually educated themselves in another field. So that's, again, I guess this is all bringing it back to like why I want to talk about other things outside of just music on my podcast. But I think people don't realize that we are well-rounded and have more interests than just music.
Yeah, I do think that that attitude is changing. I know that even after I graduated Princeton, the generation below, I just started to see different things. Many more people coming through that university who went on to music and really successfully. And also I'll say that that was one of the reasons that I chose to go to Rice, was because Mr. Fisher was one of the first teachers I met who was excited. Not just accepting of the fact that I had a different background, but excited that I was coming from something different, that I had that academic background. Because he himself, I think, has a BA in history or something like that. So not even just accepting it, but actually encouraging it and being excited for my traits. And that was one of the immediate selling factors. I was like, oh, I had met Mr. Fisher really until that, one lesson, but that was a big selling point, was like, oh, this guy sees me and appreciates me, not just dismissing it or accepting it, but being excited for me and like a cheerleader for my qualities, I guess.
Yay, so, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Don't know how much you meant.
I feel like there's got to be some kind of game for any listener of the number of times we mentioned Mr. Fisher on the
my gosh. I don't know if I have mentioned this to you, but what wound up being my epiphany, I guess, was I did a summer abroad in Madagascar, which is, a little off the beaten path. Yes, lots of lemurs. But that summer, it was obviously just a very different thing. And I think it forced me to be away from the cello for several months. But it also threw me into such a different environment culturally and socially that basically when I came back from there, I just felt a strong sense that I needed to do something that would make me happy. So I should mention, when I went to Princeton, my intention was to be an international relations, politics major. I love the classes. I thought they were really fascinating. But honestly, the more I got to know the people, the more I was like, no. This is not an environment that I can function in. No offense to all the wonderful people in politics doing great work these days. But I realized that, I think to work in politics, you do have to have a certain amount of numbness to the consequences of what you do. Because you're making some crazy hard decisions.
Right.
Even if you're doing the right thing, somebody is getting hurt.
Yeah.
And I think the more that dawned on me, particularly since I was focusing on development and developing countries as my focus, it was just so hard. My God, how do you think you're doing the right thing by throwing aid this way, throwing aid that way, not realizing you're undermining the local economy and whatever, and it's like the more information I got, the more I would feel frozen and just too wrapped up in my feelings about helping everybody. And I was like, God, this is awful. An awful feeling to kind of live with. And realizing there's some people that are just ready for it and feeling like I couldn't connect with those people. Do you know what I mean? So when push came to shove, I just didn't feel like I could function in that environment and feel like myself.
May I insert, and this is going to be also a leading question, but did you think that you couldn't necessarily cure everyone's ails from being, in their community by politics, but with music you can? You know what I'm saying? That's where I know it's a leading question.
Well, this actually leads to, this is another moment from college that I will think about almost weekly, honestly. There was this professor named Gary Bass. The class was called Politics of War, I think. But I remember the very last lecture of that semester, instead of sticking with the curriculum, decided to give us just a life talk. I think about this life talk all the time, because essentially what he told us was that there's two types of people in the world. They're the ones who fight to defend the country from external factors. So that's the politicians in some cases, people who are deciding who to go to war with, diplomats, people in the military, whatever that is. You're fending off outside forces. And so either you're one of those people or you're fighting to preserve the culture within. And what he told us was that, we need both in this world. Just pick a side and do it. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was where I saw my role as a musician. It was on the cultural side of doing what we can to keep society enriched, fulfilled, whether that's playing or teaching. But that's where I felt my role and I guess my sense of self more at ease in helping the world. And I respect the ones who feel confident going forward. And the ones, there are people doing amazing work in these fields, but I just knew that I couldn't live with myself in that kind of environment. Yeah, so I guess I fight my own little battles, especially I guess in teaching, right? That's where we have a lot of opportunity to change things for the next generation. And I definitely find a lot of empowerment in that pretty often. So I definitely don't feel like I chose an easy route in terms of just being complacent. I definitely feel still engaged and involved, but I guess turning internally towards the country is maybe where I wanted to be. All that being said, I mean, so after that summer abroad, months of like being in a country where you could only kind of talk to people because I didn't speak Malagasy, being away from even just like a bed. I was sleeping on a sponge. I'm not even joking all summer. But after all that, coming coming back to the US, I just wanted to do something I wanted to do. Like that was what the feeling was like I getting back to the cello and being like, I really like this thing. And I knew that if I didn't try now, I wasn't going to have a chance later. I really doubled down when I got back to college and I was like, okay, you're going to practice. And next summer I was at Aspen and got to work with Jared Atkins at Juilliard and Oberlin Conservatory. He was really helpful for me.
Also previous student of Norman Fisher.
Oh, right. Yes. Happy accident. Thank you, Mr. Fisher, for everything you've done. Yeah. And then, the senior year came around. I decided to go for my master's. And then, after that, I guess the path is more obvious. Wound up at Rice, eventually wound up at NEC. Now I'm doing the freelance thing here in Boston.
NEC, New England Conservatory.
Thank you. So sorry. Keep throwing out the acronyms.
So now you're in Boston. What projects are you up to?
One of the organizations I'm proudest to be working with is Castle of Our Skins, which presents the music of Black composers. Very recently, we did a performance for the Kennedy Center that was live streamed, where we did Florence Price's second string quartet in A minor, which I think there aren't actually a lot of performances out there of it, so we're proud to get to champion it. We also did works by Jesse Montgomery and Valerie Coleman. We have upcoming performances for the Phillips Collection and Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The group's been doing a lot of great things in a lot of great places, and I've actually been exposed to a lot of new repertoire through the group. And even just as a musician, I'm really grateful for those experiences. So that includes actually my introduction to George Walker's music was us learning his string quartet.
Got it.
So it's been meaningful for me just for my development, but then it also feels really powerful to get to play these masterpieces, which for most of our audiences is their first time hearing these things.
Isn't Castle of Our Skins also primarily BIPOC musicians as well?
Yes, definitely primarily. Mm-hmm. So that's also really empowering. Again, I guess coming back to this idea of sharing the stage with people who both look like you and unlike you. There's just that thing about your identity that you have in common. Yeah. And again, often we don't really get to face that in our field.
Right. That's what we're trying to tackle, I think, right now in classical music. How long has Castle of Our Skins been around? So it's not something that just came up because of George Floyd and the whole social justice movement. It's been around for a few years at least.
I think it's been at least 8 years now.
Yeah. Obviously, these organizations are now being presented, which is absolutely necessary. And why didn't this happen earlier? But for instance, Ashley Gordon was recently on a podcast episode of Jonathan Van Ness's Getting Curious, which I'm jealous. She talked to Jonathan about the systemic racism in classical music. I believe the episode is, Are We Hearing a Crescendo
of Anti-Racism in Classical Music?
I would recommend that podcast and as well listening to that episode.
I mean, I know it's kind of a harsh statement, but I think it's true. I mean, in some ways, Black is the new Black in classical music. Of course, like, it's great that people are having a moment of reckoning and really trying to do better. Of course, that's appreciated. But at the same time, it's like when you see it all happen in just one wave, like everyone goes, oh, oops, we better all program the same Florence Price. It's like, gosh, but people like Ash and Anthony have been doing this well before it was in fashion, I mean, it was their mission and they, it's just fun. The world is weird like that. But at the same time, I'm happy to be seeing more composers of color on program. Shouldn't have been such a revelation, but here we are.
I know, it's like a light switch or something. It's kind of odd. Yeah.
I love getting to work with Castle of Our Skins. I also occasionally will play on the New Gallery Concert Series, which I guess feeds into my contemporary music love, but a lot of those programs are curated around art exhibits in collaboration with living artists. I am recently joined the faculty of NEC Prep, as well as the BYSO, Boston Youth Symphony Orchestra, I believe, their intensive community program. So I'm teaching privately as well as group classes for them, and have some private students that I really enjoy working with. And I guess on top of that, I work at Cello Bello. So Cello Bello is essentially almost like a one-stop shop for all nerdy things cello. It's a website that has, blogs, masterclass archives, some teaching videos and things like that. But it's also one that tries to engage artists to interact with our community with a lot of live events like cello chats and things like that. For anyone listening, freelancing means that you just do a lot of different stuff with a lot of different people, as opposed to like having one affiliation. I mean, beyond that.
I think sometimes there's a bit of a stigma when someone says you're a freelance musician, because it's sort of like you couldn't fit into one group, like the Boston Symphony. Let's just use that as an example. Sure. So like, it's kind of like, oh, you have to do all this grunty work around. And sometimes it is kind of grunt work, but it also is kind of nice. I guess I would consider myself a freelance musician, even though I am I'm a part of the Artaria String Quartet. Artaria String Quartet is my primary group, but I do affiliate with Kinetic Ensemble and 10th Wave and other various little groups around. And it's a lot of fun to collaborate with a lot of different people rather than being stuck in the one group for the rest of your life sort of idea, which Artaria fills that role. And not only is it just performing, but as what you're saying about cello bellows, sometimes it's an administrative role under the umbrella of being a freelance musician.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I mean, in normal times, there's even other non-cello things I do. Like, I have on occasion written program notes for DSO during Tanglewood. Given my academic background, it's actually great to get to flex those muscles. Yeah. And it's funny that I've found that writing skill to actually lead to a lot of other types of work and a lot of other kind of acknowledgments. So you never know. I mean, my gosh, if we learned anything in the pandemic, having extra skills beyond I play an instrument there's just no way around it for this generation. That era of like, oh, and I have one job and I'm done forever, that is no longer the reality for any classical musician. Right. Because even then, some of the named jobs, I mean, a lot of state orchestras are downgrading what the job means more and more. So even those musicians have to find other work. I mean, and usually it's teaching, obviously, most of the time, but some will start their own series, some will do other things. And in a sense that's going to be the norm, is people having their hands in multiple cookie jars. Is that the expression? At the same time, little oatmeal raisin, little chocolate chip. I don't know.
I want cookies now.
This will be the new metaphor.
Okay.
But there's a lot of other things I do. Because even performing wise, I mean, obviously I teach, perform with a lot of different groups. Sometimes I'll collaborate, for example, with Jason Truding, who is a percussionist with So Percussion. Love him and his wife. They're like wonderful people. We've done quite a few projects, including a Yellow Barn artist residency and a performance at the Miller Theater. These days we're doing some stuff recorded, virtual. Right. I will sub with orchestras on occasion, like Sarasota Orchestra. And then on top of that, I mean, I'm working, taking auditions occasionally. So that's my own just private work that I need to figure out. And so I guess aside from, organizations and groups that I affiliate with. So my roommate is also a longtime chamber collaborator. And so we've actually started to do our own projects, which has been really great. So Mary, Sam, and I are in the midst of forming a string trio. And so occasionally we've done a few concerts. So we hope to do more. It's nice to also be able to do that, put on a bit of an entrepreneurial hat and to just create our own thing.
Do you have a name for your group?
We are the Chroma Trio. We're working on our first commission, which will come out near the end of next year. We just like playing together.
And so the violinist is Sam Bennett. She's the principal second of the Sarasota Orchestra, and Mary Ferrello is the violist, who is a section player of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And it's also really exciting for me to see Tanglewood alum get together and be awesome performers.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to a cello quartet concert with the Celebrity Series that's going to happen in December, which I know, Patty, that's cello ensembles up your alley. It's really great. It's a program being curated by Mike Block of the Silk Road Ensemble, and it's a program of globally inspired music. Probably the next big performance I have coming up that is actually live, that involves one take, but live stream kind of concert. So I'm really excited for that.
Great.
I believe it's December 3rd. I think it's a Thursday night.
Great. So mark your calendars.
Yeah.
And we'll promote your concert on social media. So keep your eyes out.
Thank you.
So Sushi is starting to play with some of the leaves falling because it's beginning to be autumn, which is like a little scary for me because that means snow. But shall we take a break?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. We'll be right back. Welcome back from the break. So before the break, Francesca and I were having a little pre-dinner munchies, I suppose.
Indeed. It was delicious.
Yeah, it was good. I had a couple pickles and some strawberries, and you had a piece of bread with jam on it?
So not just bread and jam, Patty. That is bread that I made myself in quarantine because I have become a bit of a sourdough
You and Lucas should talk.
We should. I think there's a conversation to be had there.
He's also gotten into bread, and he wanted to talk about bread in addition to coffee. So maybe we'll have Lucas back on the show for a bread discussion. But anyway.
That would be great. Well, then on top of that, though, that jam is from my landlord who made his own jam from the blackberries in the garden. So
oh my God.
One thing that's funny about quarantine is that I've noticed that for my circle of people, we're kind of going back to old bargaining. We're bargaining our goods. That's the new currency. So I gave him some bread. He gave us some jam. Not just bread and jam, Patty.
Yeah, geez, you have a whole ecosystem and economic system going on.
I literally traded half a loaf for a soundpost adjustment.
Really?
She has struggled to make bread, so she appreciates that it's not that easy. And also sample adjustments are actually like hard. And so she's like, trade.
Right.
$7 for this piece of bread. It's like, okay.
Awesome. So aside from the yummy snacks we are having, let's talk about your interests in the trends of music education in our country. Can you explain a little more about what that means to you?
I'm certainly not the most researched person on these things. And there's just a lot of things that I've noticed anecdotally from my experiences teaching in this town, but also in other towns. One of the things that I'm sort of the most confused about, and I hope doesn't weaken this upcoming generation too much, I don't know if it comes out of the need to be as inclusive as possible. I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but I've noticed that a lot of curriculums these days are more concerned with the students feeling good that they've achieved something as opposed to teaching the kids anything. Everyone feels like they've achieved something and they've gotten their participation trophy, as opposed to having sweated really hard to actually succeed and to acquire skills, tangible things, tangible knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed it in context of music in that there's just some places that I've taught where I've noticed that the curriculum just seems so dumbed down. And when I've tried to have conversations unpacking like why that is, like why aren't we teaching the kids to sound good? Like frankly, for lack of a better word, it's like I just see curriculums in which it's more worried about, I don't know, just making sure they get their gold star than actually making sure they sound good in a way that will put them in a competitive edge when they leave this program. Like I would think that the point of teaching is to make sure the kids are actually equipped with tools, whether that's, and I'm talking about teaching instruments, but I think there's so much you can teach a kid about how to function in life at their instrument, about how to problem solve, about how to have grit and perseverance at their instrument, right? I mean, you could teach a kid to love music without an instrument in hand, and that's, of course, valuable. That's great. Teach a kid to appreciate the arts without necessarily putting the instrument in their hands. But in my opinion, the reason you put the instrument in their hands is to teach them the hard work. It's to teach them what happens when they really persevere, they listen, they try to incorporate someone else's ideas, they try to work beyond they think their capacity is at, and they achieve something that they didn't think they could do. And I know I've had some moments with students of, like, there was one student that I had started teaching, classical music and cello was completely foreign to her. It wasn't like she had a parent that was musical. It was just a total blank slate for her. And I remember being shocked at how apprehensive she was to work. And I remember that when I talked to her father, who was, really, really great, he mentioned that the reason they wanted her to learn an instrument was because they heard it was hard. Because she was a student that was in school, everything felt easy. She was getting A's without working for it, and she didn't know what it felt like to work hard at something.
Struggle, in other words.
To struggle, exactly. That was her parents' motivation for signing her up for cello lessons. I remember in several of the early lessons that she would just say, I can't do that, a lot. Like I'd say, hey, let's pluck the string. I can't do that. Can you pluck louder? I can't. Can you put your hand? No, I can't. Sweetest kid. And she wasn't trying to be difficult. It was just a sincere, like, nope, I can't do that. Like my imagination stops here. I don't see a scenario in which I can do what you're asking. And, it took some coaxing. And I remember one of the first moments that maybe it was like the first time she was blowing long notes or something like that. And she sounded great. It was gorgeous. And I remember being like, do you remember when you told me you couldn't do that last week? And this girl just looked at me with like a little smirk. And she knew it. Like in that moment, she felt, okay, yeah, I did the thing that I said I couldn't do. And as the year progressed, I stopped hearing that come out of her. Of course, there are times where she would say, well, that's hard. That's what the conversation became, was like, oh, that's hard. And I'd say, yeah, but you could do it. And giving her that feedback. And I don't think I hear her say that anymore. I don't know when was the last time I heard her say I can't.
Then you taught her the best lesson possible already.
Exactly. And that's what I'm talking about. It's like, those are the things that you can teach with an instrument in hand. And I guess I get really resentful when I see curriculums that take out the work. And I get particularly incensed when some programs that I've worked with where the communities they go into are predominantly Black and brown. And that's where I get particularly frustrated, where I'm not trying to accuse anybody of having a cultural bias in that regard or racial bias explicitly. But as a person of color, that drives me especially nuts. Don't look at these kids and tell me they can't achieve incredible things. Don't you dare tell me that. Nothing enrages me more than that attitude.
As I was listening to what you're saying, I had a couple of thoughts. And
sure.
When you first were talking about it, I was thinking, okay, so basically we're teaching with the wrong motivation in mind. Rather than teaching someone something for the purpose of gaining a life skill, either on a practical sense of playing cello for the rest of your life or just overcoming a personal hurdle of some sort, the motivation is directed at getting by. Or maybe even gaining, we call it a participation trophy, but it's just maybe affection from an outside source. That it's not really internalized internalized thing. Like that's where a skill set is an internalized thing that then you can even profess to people later, like we did with instruments and whatnot.
I'm realizing maybe another way I could have phrased it was that I see an attitude of making sure the kids don't experience failure as opposed to ensuring they experience success, right? It's like the negative attitude.
That was my next point, though, was actually we have this fear of teaching our kids what failure feels like. And as much as no one wants to be in that position, I mean, I don't like failing. The number of times I lost auditions after practicing, man. But but at the same time, like you're removing this incredible tool for someone to learn what it feels like to move away from that feeling. If you never experience it, you're living a life in a very monochromatic scale.
Right. No, and even I think what's the best lesson you could teach somebody is that they can fail and still succeed later. You know, they can fail in a moment and pick themselves back up and like actually still ultimately achieve everything they want to achieve. That failure is a part of the process. I don't know. It's like we act as if everyone's on eggshells. We better not let them trip or let them just make sure they don't experience anything bad and they go through life having only good feelings. It's like, why not let them have many feelings? You know, sometimes life is hard, sometimes life is great. Let this be a microcosm for how they're going to have to deal with their life, which is that when they go through hardship, they find a way to get back up, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that people are afraid of. Not just kids, not just anyone who's in that position of failure, but even, let's say, parents watching their kid fail in some way. The fear behind it is that they don't know what it's going to look like, how they're going to succeed in some way. You know, we want to, again, put ourselves in this one track. I go to school, I learn this, then I use that tool and I get into the advanced program here, and then I do this, and then I get a job, and then I get a dog, and then I get a whatever, you know, like it's the game of life sort of, but that's not actually how it always works. We never want to see a student fail, but we also know that that's part of the human experience. And by not having those lows, you won't know how to build yourself to have fewer lows.
Right. One lesson that I honestly am probably only really reckoning with now, you know, later in life, failing doesn't make you a failure. I think that's a message that's the opposite of what we're taught a lot of the times, right? It's like people just boast about their accolades and they're just like, oh, this prize, that prize, this blah, blah, blah. I think we get the attitude of like, almost being a little too goal-oriented in terms of why we do something, right? Like, do you play cello in order to win Tchaikovsky, or do you play cello because you love the cello and want to build a life with it, right? Yeah, but it's like, that's just a big lesson to teach people. It's like, failing doesn't make you a failure. Failing is a thing that happens. It's inevitable. Just like experiencing pain doesn't make you a loser, doesn't make you an idiot, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. Pain is a part of life. And I can't help but, I guess, see all these things as being linked, especially when you talk to the little ones. Kids will say things that you're like, oh my God. You know, like they're processing a lot of big thoughts. Even if they're little people with narrow amount of experience through life, they're already reckoning with things that they're going to be dealing with for the rest of their lives. And I guess I get sensitive to the idea of delaying that reality check for them for another decade. Like, are you kidding me? Want this kid to graduate high school and learn that life is hard? Whew. Like, I'd hope not, you know? So I do think about that all the time in my teaching. So I have to admit, there's a book that I read recently that my mentor recommended to me because I was saying some things and I see exactly why she threw this book my way. But it's called Mindset, and it's by Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist, I guess, or psychiatrist. A lot of it's about this. It's about the fixed versus growth mindset and how when you have a fixed mindset, you believe that certain qualities about you are fixed. So imagine that if I have a fixed mindset about, say, my musical abilities, in my brain, I might tell myself, okay, I know that I'm really only a B+ cellist, okay? I'm a B+ cellist. So then you don't want to do anything in life that might show to the world that you're less than that, right? So I don't want to take that competition and do badly and reveal to the world that actually, no, I'm a C cellist. Crap, you know? Like, we'd rather avoid the difficulty in order to sort of insulate ourselves from a reality of having to reckon between where we think our abilities are and what we actually are. But I think the other problem with the fixed mindset is that you don't believe that your abilities are really going to grow. So if you're defensive and you think you're always going to be that level of a whatever at the skill you're describing,
you're capping your potential, in other words.
That too, right? As opposed to believing that those are fluid qualities and that believing in the process of allowing them to grow and develop, right? But it's a book that's got me thinking a lot because you have to teach kids honestly. Like, it's not helpful for them to think they're succeeding when they're not. And I don't mean you have to be harsh. I'm not talking about being like super cruel to a child. Dear God, no. But kids can take more truth than you think. Like, kids want to feel smart. They want to feel successful. If they're not achieving fully at their potential, show them where the line is and then help them get there. That's your job as a teacher. Right. And so anytime I see a curriculum that seems to want to just cap people's potential at where they are, I just get so so mad. I'm like, this is not what's going to help them.
Right.
They're not going to have left any of this with any kind of a lesson that's going to help them. So
yeah, and also one would hope a teacher would know how to console, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but console a student when they do experience temporary failure, right? And if they didn't reach the goal that they were hoping to. I think it's out of reaction to a couple generations ago of in pop culture even, there's the portrayal of music teachers being very strict and almost to an extreme, almost abusive, slapping kids on the wrist or whatever, you know. And I understand, like, of course, we're not promoting that kind of teaching by any means, but it means that you have to allow a little bit of independence for the kid to walk his or her walk.
Right. You want them to grow and change to how they want to be. I mean, it's not, again, about either forcing them down a path they don't want to be on either. It's not about that. But most of the time, if you just extend your hand and offer to hold it, kids will want to go with you.
I mean, I feel like I could continue to talk about this particular point and how we teach music to students, but I didn't know if you had any other points that you wanted to bring up.
This is probably more in the realm of community engagement. Outreach, as it used to be called, but that's becoming a pretty dated term. And I guess for anyone who's like wondering why that is, a lot of it's sort of the colonizer mindset of like, oh, outreach, let me bring my religion to you or whatever, as opposed
in this
to
case, religion being classical music.
Well, European tradition, even like more specifically, right? And as opposed to the idea of community engagement, where you're trying to make it interactive, trying to make it more of an experience as opposed to a lecture. But within that sort of realm, there's also this sort of cultural argument that I don't understand around classical music as it coincides with race. You know, you hear those people who utter the words that classical music is somehow not for Black people.
Really?
Oh, I saw a post recently. Actually, I believe this was on Daniel Bernard Roumain. He's a composer, a New York-based Haitian background composer. I forget where, but it was something publicly on his Facebook page, and so it's been screenshotted and shared places. But at some point in this comment thread, this man goes, well, Black people can't play classical music. They're good at jazz.
Oh, no.
The year is 2020. I'm like, oh, boy.
Oh, that's painful.
Ooh, it hurts. I mean, I think it was actually worded worse than that. That's just the...
Yeah, that's
whatever.
the PC version.
The PC version. Which, of course, people think that.
Come on.
But I have, occasionally you hear like versions of that in conversations, just that passive, like, you know, if we're going to go to, say, a community engagement at a high school where a lot of students are African-American, are they really going to get our music? You know, I mean, that's the attitude you hear. That's the version of it. It's like, is that really for them? I don't know. Let's bring them some hip hop. I know this can be complicated because, of course, there's an argument to be made of including things that are maybe culturally more relevant in some cases. I mean, I get that, but where I completely disagree is when people imply that there's something about a person of a different race that intellectually they wouldn't get our music. That argument I don't buy at all. Like, if you want to make an argument that, say, like Eurocentric classical music only belongs to European people, then explain to me how on earth anybody created a British-style board choir, Haiti of all places, that went on to be incredibly successful, and they were hosted by the BSO to come perform at Tanglewood. But, you know, they went on to achieve a lot of great things, and a lot of the people from that program went on to be professional musicians in the States and things like that in other places and started their own teaching program. You know, it was an incubation program in a sense for a lot of people that did a lot of great good. And if you want to make a cultural relevance argument for me, I feel like Haiti would be your worst case to explain away as like, is it still the poorest country in this hemisphere? Probably, you know, like culturally not so strongly linked to the Eurocentricity of white Eurocentricity in particular. I mean, I know I guess I had that early example. I mean, my mom conducted the choir. She played in the violin. My godmother, godfather, cousins, like we were all a part of this ensemble. And of course, there was a mix of Mendelssohn violin concerto would happen, but so would arrangements of Haitian music. Like it all happened on the same stage. Nobody was going, I don't get Mendelssohn. No, people were happy to play it. It was beautiful music. Like nobody was upset about it, right? And I know, again, this is my own kind of privileged life experience. I get that. Just fundamentally, I just don't understand the cultural argument that people just won't get it. I think if you have an artist or not doing your job at presenting programs well, that's a you problem. It's not a them problem, you know?
Well, can I reflect back a little bit? Sure. An example. I've had to explain the form, the structure of jazz music, the standard jazz form to people before. Didn't matter what background they came from. They couldn't understand it until I explained it to them. People say the same thing about classical music all the time. So how is there any cultural difference there?
Right.
Like it's all about, as what you're saying, education. We can teach people what a sonata form is. We can teach people what a rondo form is. People can grasp onto the idea of a sonata form being two main melodies, goes through a washing machine of a development, and then it all returns back home. And then we finish that movement in a happy place, right? Like that narrative everyone can understand. Jazz, everyone can understand. The main melody is stated at the beginning. Everyone else goes through this washing machine and does all these improvisations off of it. And then you restate the main theme at the end again.
Right.
It's the same idea, except in a different form.
Right. Music is just another type of language. That's all it is. And language can be taught.
Right.
I mean, and there's a way to teach it that doesn't mean oppressing people's histories in the way that has happened in a lot of the world, right? You can teach about aspects of European music and not make it this biblical statement about, like, wash your hands of your pagan past and let's follow me. You don't have to do that. People have done that, and that's tragic.
Right.
In a lot of cases. There are ways to make up for it, I think. But it's just a language. And if you give people a way in, they can be with you. And maybe in some cases, maybe sometimes when you're introducing a language for the first time to somebody, maybe it's hard. It'll be easier the next time. It's just about exposure and sharing in all of it, sharing in the culture. And this whole hard line of but it's my culture. You won't get it. I don't buy it. Maybe you might feel, if you're not comfortable sharing, maybe you as the performer have to learn to do a better job, or you, the presenting organization, whoever it is who's responsible, I guess, have to just get more used to this and get used to being uncomfortable. Coming back to that feeling, right? That's hard work. Yeah, it is. I know it's uncomfortable for people, but I won't accept a world in which we say that we can't share in each other's experiences. Somehow we can't learn to empathize and can't learn to share and can't learn to communicate and enjoy that. I don't know. I'm stubborn. I know I'm stubborn.
No, I was going to say that's kind of the irony of your argument, though, is that you're stubborn and asking people to grow. Right? Because
I demand it.
Because when we're growing as people, it's always going to be uncomfortable. It's never going to be settled, right? When we're comfortable, that means we're not actually challenging ourselves.
Right. No, and there's just something to be said about, the analogy of personal growth, I think absolutely translates to a societal growth. And we're going through some huge growing pains right now in terms of reckoning with everything. It's growing pains is a simple way to put it, but the reckoning is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to ask you to change things that are ingrained about you. It's going to ask you to apologize, ask you to make up for things. That's just the way life is. And again, I don't know if some of this is because I think in the last couple decades, America's gotten to be, the way that we consume things has gotten to be so insane. Everything is about instant gratification. I think it's part of the problem too. It's we want the instant gratification of, I did a good job. I'm a good person. I nailed it. That's what we expect in everything, because nowadays I can honestly just click a link on Instagram and buy a 5-piece bedroom furniture set, in a moment, just use my FaceTime on my phone and I got stuff showing up at my door, don't have to click on a thing. And I wonder
Amazon,
if okay, this all boils down to Amazon. It's Amazon's fault. Let's be honest. No, but so I don't know if some of it comes out of that as a culture, we're just spinning so far in that direction of no effort, instant gratification, instant fixes, instant appeasement. And, it's maybe that's a part of the problem too, but it's just not how things work. The tough stuff is supposed to be hard. I don't mean to be that crotchety person, but the youth, I don't know. It's not even just the youth. It's all over the place nowadays, but
I think what's challenging about all of this, though, is that it forces people to self-reflect. And that sometimes is a more challenging thing than one might expect, especially in how they're being self-reflective. That is one thing I can say about going through conservatory. It makes you maybe almost too extremely hyper aware of who you are and what your strengths and weaknesses are. I say in a music conservatory setting, it might be a little bit on the unhealthy spectrum, but certainly in life, it's taught me how to self-reflect on many different stances I've taken in my past. I don't know how many professions challenge the people in them to self-reflect on such a almost daily level that it takes to be a musician.
I've noticed similar conversations when I meet people in other fields these days. People are always shocked when I have to explain so what's practicing? It's well, you wake up every day with a nice dose of self-criticism. And the good reality check, you're not as hot as you thought you were. Great. And then you have to reckon with it every day. Of course, there are musicians who don't do that, but my experience is that the ones who thrive in this field with humility and positive connections and relationships and are happy with their life and what they're doing are the ones who find a way to sustain that as much as possible. Nobody's perfect. It's not every day. We all have bad days. Here we go with the self-criticism.
I know.
But no, you're totally right. I do think about this often, which is maybe where I get excited teaching again. Because, when I teach my students, it's not because I need them all to become professional cellists. If they want to, I want to support them. That's great. But everything about what they learn at the instrument is going to help them in life. I think that ability to be self-reflective is a really big part of learning to be an empathetic person.
Right.
Because if you storm through life never reflecting on how you impact people around you, with no sense of like internal reflection, well, welcome to 2020 and our entire political climate these days. You know, it's like you just people screaming. It's like, you're evil. I'm good. You're bad. You know, like it just drives, that also exhausts me. It's like, what happened to empathy? Like, where on earth did that go? And not that teaching kids cello is going to fix it all, but that's my part.
Our mission is deeper rooted than just what you see on the surface. At least that's my belief and hope when I perform, is that I'm trying to mend all the chatter that's happening in the world. Mm-hmm. That is even more important in 2020 in choosing repertoire, choosing what audiences we perform to and how we cater concerts to them. It brings it so much closer to community and how we impact from within, as what you're saying.
There's a shared emotion, whether that's between the performers and the piece they're playing, whether that's between the performers and the audience, and that sort of shared listening that's happening. And I guess in that sense, artists get to be vehicles for empathy. That's the role we get to play. And, you know, if there's any lesson to be gained from this year, is that we can't move forward without empathy. We can't have a community without empathy. We can't be a collective without empathy. And so coming back to that point that my teacher had made, that's the fight that I feel empowered by. My hope is that we find a way together, and I hope that artists continue to, you know, get in the trenches to help.
Yeah. Man, maybe this is why we bonded. Is this the Dark and Twisties that we're talking about?
I think we have descended into the Dark and Twisties. You're welcome. Welcome, everyone, to our dark place. This is where Patty and I, this is where we met, where we reside, where we continue to thrive.
Okay, I mean, I'm jesting, but I think certainly as musicians, as we're saying, we have to reevaluate our roles all the time, why we're doing what we're doing and how we can help. So are there any platforms or websites for our listeners to learn more about you or any upcoming projects other than the cello quartet one?
Yes, I'll mention that again. So it's a Thursday, and I'm pretty sure December 3rd. Check out the Celebrity Series of Boston. There's a concert of the neighborhood arts cellists. It's going to be a very, very cool program. My website's supposed to be launching very soon, francescamcneeley.com. McNeeley. Lots of E's.
That's the last name, yeah.
Yeah, the last name is the part that people tend to have difficulties with. I know that the concert that I just did with Mary for Archipelago Collective is still online if anybody wants to check it out. Highly recommend. I think I'll have a link to that on the website. If you go to Cello Bello's Facebook page, I think the handle is Cello Bello Fans, you'll find the 2 Walker panels that I was moderating. Please check those out. If you want to check out events with Castle of Our Skins, the website is castleskins.org.
Great. And if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please subscribe and leave, hopefully, a positive review on Apple Podcasts. It helps this podcast reach more people, and it makes me feel good. And actually, I only have about 3 reviews. I have a lot of stars, but not written reviews. So I enjoy reading them. I would love to see more if you are willing and have a little bit of time to just write something. You can also give feedback at our email, haydnmusicstand@gmail.com. If there's something you'd like to suggest or say hi, sharing with your friends and family is a free way to support this podcast. And if you'd like, you may also visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/haydnmusicstand. And thank you to all my current Patreon subscribers. You are awesome. And I would love to have more to the family. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haydn Music Stand, to access more content. There's also a Spotify playlist available with all the pieces we discussed on the show. You can find that in the description of each episode. Thanks for being on the show, Francesca.
Thank you so much for having me, Patty. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, even if we get into the dark and twisties. I know, you know what? Especially when we get into the dark and twisties. I love it.
I suppose. Yeah, I would agree with that. And thanks for listening.
Yay.
Say bye, Sushi.
This is what's hard about talking with your friends, because like your like unfiltered self just hops out, and it's not great for the kids. It's not PG. So I still think about him all the time. I remember writing to him. So I still think about him, not all the time, because God, that's weird. See, this is what I'm saying. What's wrong with me? I had an older sister. I have an older sister. See, things like this that I do. Like, why do I say things like that?
Because you're speaking in the past tense, and that's where that.
See, if I had like a cute accent or something, it would be dismissed. I got it.